Hi, this is Dale Whitman welcoming you to ProfDale's Property Video number 8. The topic is an introduction to future interests. This is one of a series of videos about the details of future interests, and this will be the first. So we need to begin by asking what we mean by a future interest. Despite the term, it doesn't mean that someone is getting an interest in land in the future. No, if you have a future interest, you own the interest in the land right now, in the present. But the interest gives you possession of the land, not today, but at some time in the future. So the thing that's in the future, when you have a future interest, is possession and not ownership. Now, there are 5 kinds of future interests, and each of them has a weird name, like remainder or reversion. One of the things we're going to do later in this video is learn how to identify each type of future interest. Before we do, you might ask yourself, how do these future interest names fit into the chart of interests in land that we did back in video number 5? Well, the answer is that they don't fit at all because they're describing a different characteristic. The chart of interests in land deals with the name of the estate, and the name of each estate indicates how long it will last when it becomes possessory. The fee simple, absolute, the fee tail, the life estate, the non-freehold estates, all of those indicate duration. They indicate how long an estate will last. But the name of the future interest doesn't indicate how long it will last. It indicates how and when the future interest will become possessory. Now that means that in order to fully specify a future interest, to fully describe it, we have to say both its name as a future interest and its name as an estate that will apply once it becomes possessory. Let's take an example. Here's O making a deed to A for life. Well, what will happen when A dies? Obviously, that's the end of the life estate, and since nothing more has been said, we know the property will return to O, and O will get possession. So right now, O has a future interest, an expectation that when A's life estate ends, O will get possession of the property back again. So how do we describe O's future interest? Well, we'd first say that O has a reversion. That's its future interest name, and don't worry about the details of that. We haven't covered why it's called a reversion yet, but trust me that it is. That indicates how and when it'll become possessory. And then we'd say it's a reversion in fee simple absolute, and that indicates how long it will last when it becomes possessory. How long will O's estate last once it becomes possessory in O? And the answer is indefinitely into the future, and that's what makes it a reversion in fee simple absolute. When it becomes possessory, it will then last indefinitely in the future. And that's the nature of a fee simple absolute. Here's another example. Once again, we have to say both the future interest name and the estate name to fully describe a future interest. So in this example, O, who starts out owning a fee simple absolute, conveys to A for life, then to B for life, and then to C. Well, let's take a look at B's future interest. Obviously, it is a future interest because B doesn't get possession until A dies. We'd say that B has a remainder. That's its future interest name. And once again, don't worry about why we call it a remainder. We'll cover that in a few minutes. But we'd say that it's a remainder that's only going to last for B's lifetime. So we could say it's a remainder by way of a life estate, or in other words, a remainder for life. Now that takes care of fully describing B's future interest. What about C's future interest? Once again, C has a remainder, and don't worry about why it's called a remainder now. But when C gets it, it's going to last indefinitely into the future in C. So we would say that C has a remainder, a future interest, in fee simple absolute. Just to reemphasize, whenever we want to fully describe a future interest, we have to say both its name as a future interest and its name as an estate, which will indicate how long it will last when it becomes possessory. Now, in reality, when discussing a future interest, we don't always bother stating what type of estate it will be when it becomes possessory. It gets a little cumbersome if we have to keep doing that. But that information is always necessary to fully specify the future interest. Most future interests are in fee simple absolute. In other words, most of the time, when a future interest becomes possessory, it will last indefinitely into the future. But not always. We have to read the details of the conveyance, the deed or the will that created the future interest, and see how long it's going to last. Now we're ready to talk about the names of the 5 kinds of future interests. They divide into 2 categories, which are easy to remember. The first category consists of future interests that are created in a grantor. There are 3 of those. We'll talk about their names in a minute. The other category is future interests that are created in somebody other than the grantor. There are 2 of those types. Now what this means is that you need to be able to tell the difference between the 2 categories, and so the first question you always ought to ask whenever you see a future interest in any conveyance, any deed, or any will, is to say, is that future interest being created in the grantor, in which case it's one of the first 3 kinds, or is it being created in somebody other than the grantor, in which case it's one of the last 2 kinds. We're going to focus for a few minutes on the future interests that are created in a grantor. Those are the first category that we talked about on the previous slide. There are 3 of them, as we mentioned, so let's list them. The first one is called a possibility of reverter, and it always follows and has to follow either a fee simple determinable or some other determinable estate. Usually it's a fee simple determinable estate, but it could be a life estate that's determinable or a leasehold that's determinable. The second is the right of entry or power of termination. It always follows a fee simple on condition subsequent or some other estate that's subject to a condition subsequent. Now you'll notice we've already covered both of these future interests when we talked about defeasible fee estates. The possibility of reverter always linked to a determinable estate, the right of entry or power of termination always linked to a estate on condition subsequent. The third category is called a reversion, and it's sort of defined by exclusion. It's any future interest that's created in the grantor and isn't number 1 or number 2. We'll take a look at examples of these in just a moment. Let's start with this example. O owns land in fee simple absolute and conveys to A for A's life, or to make it simple, O would just say, I convey to A for life. The question is, what sort of future interest does O have after making that conveyance? Now here's our reasoning. First of all, does O have a future interest at all? And the answer is, of course O does, because O is entitled to possession of the land, but only when A's life estate ends. So possession is deferred until A dies. O owns the interest now, but doesn't get possession until a future date. So it must be a future interest. Second, that future interest is created in the grantor. O is the person who has the future interest, and O is the person who created the life estate. So O created the future interest in himself or herself. That means it's in that first big category of future interests, the kind that are created in a grantor. But it doesn't follow an estate that's determinable or subject to a condition subsequent. Those terms don't apply to A's life estate at all. Therefore, O's future interest must be the third of the 3 kinds of future interests that are created in a grantor, namely a reversion. And that's the right answer. Now here's another example. O conveys to A, but with the land to revert to O if cows are placed on the land. This looks like a fee simple determinable. It sounds as though the reversion of the land to O is going to take place automatically. Obviously, it's a future interest because O doesn't get possession now, but only in the future and only if cows are placed on the land. So A has a fee simple determinable estate. Notice that it's not a life estate. It doesn't say to A for life. Even if it did, that would make it a life estate that was determinable. But in this case, there's no limitation to A's life, and therefore it's a fee simple that might last indefinitely in the future, but it could end if cows are placed on the land, so it's a fee simple determinable. Now what about O's future interest? Well, obviously it is a future interest that's created in the grantor, and therefore it's the first of the three kinds of future interest created in the grantor, the kind that's always linked to a fee simple or other determinable estate, namely the possibility of reverter. Let's take the same example, but this time let's assume that after O conveys to A with the determinable language in the deed, O conveys by a later deed all of her interest in the land to X. Now O has a possibility of reverter, as we said on the previous slide, so now O is conveying that possibility of reverter to X. What does X have? Well, the answer is it's still a possibility of reverter. And that's a basic principle that you want to remember. A future interest that's conveyed to somebody else, that gets transferred, in other words, doesn't change its name. It keeps the same name. By the way, is it okay to transfer a future interest? Well, it used to be that there were a lot of complicated rules about which future interest could and could not be transferred. But today, nearly all courts would simply say, sure, if you have a future interest and you want to transfer it to somebody else by a deed or by a will, you're perfectly free to do so. However, remember that a future interest doesn't change its name if it gets transferred. Now here's a slightly different example. O again owns land in fee simple absolute and conveys it to A, but if cows are placed on the land, O may re-enter and terminate the estate. Now this sounds like another defeasible estate, but it's not a fee simple determinable, because this time, in order for O to terminate A's estate, O has to take some affirmative action. We would call that language about re-entering simply language of re-entry, and that of course indicates that A has a fee simple subject to conditions subsequent. Once again, it's not a life estate. It isn't limited to A's life. It could possibly last indefinitely into the future, but it will only end if O takes action, so that makes it a fee simple on condition subsequent. Now because of that, O has a right of entry, or power of termination, the second of the three kinds of future interests that are created in a grantor. Once again, it's not a reversion. Here's one more example. And you'll notice that this time I changed the letters that represent the parties because this is a lease. So I'm going to call the grantor L, which stands for landlord, and I'm going to call the grantee T, which stands for tenant. And the landlord leases the property to the tenant for 10 years. Well, the tenant obviously has a non-freehold or leasehold estate. You'll remember that from our chart of interests in land. And in this case, it's a fixed-term leasehold estate. Now, what will happen to the property when the lease comes to an end? T obviously has to move off the property, and possession will come back to the landlord. So the landlord has a future interest. You'll notice that T's leasehold estate is not determinable or subject to a condition subsequent, and that means that the landlord's future interest here, the right to get the possession of the property back again when the lease is over, is a reversion. Now this is kind of an amazing fact. Anytime a landlord makes a lease to a tenant, no matter how long or short the lease is, every landlord has a future interest, a reversion. Most landlords have no idea that they have a reversion. They probably couldn't even spell reversion. But the nature of being a landlord is that you do have a reversion. It's a future interest, the right to get possession of the property back again when the lease expires. So let's play around a little with the example of the landlord leasing to the tenant for 10 years. Suppose after that lease is entered into, the landlord executes a deed, a separate deed at a later time, to the tenant. What does the landlord have to convey by that deed? Well, the answer, of course, is the landlord has a reversion. And so the reversion will pass by that deed to the tenant. Technically, we'd use the term released, and we'd say the landlord releases the reversion, the future interest, to the tenant. But again, don't be put off by the word released. It's simply a conveyance of the landlord's future interest to the tenant. Well, now the tenant has both the leasehold estate that the tenant had before and the reversion, the future interest that the tenant has just acquired from the landlord. So the result is what we call a merger. A merger happens anytime one person acquires all of the interests in the land. So the reversion merges with the leasehold estate, and now the tenant has all of the interests in the land. And whenever that occurs, whenever one person gets all of the interests in the land, that person has a fee simple absolute. In fact, that's the very definition of a fee simple absolute. It's all of the interest in the land. So by virtue of the merger of the two interests, the tenant has a fee simple absolute. Now let's take a look at the same example, but suppose a transfer occurs in the other direction. Here, the tenant conveys by deed to the landlord the tenant's leasehold estate. Once again, the execution of that deed will pass the leasehold estate to the landlord. Nothing wrong with doing that. It's perfectly okay. And so we'd say the tenant has surrendered the leasehold to the landlord. Well, now the landlord has both of the outstanding interests in the land. The landlord has both the reversion that the landlord had before and also has the leasehold estate that the tenant previously had. So the leasehold estate merges with the landlord's reversion, and the result is that now the landlord, by virtue of that merger, has a fee simple absolute. Again, nothing mysterious or difficult about a merger. It happens anytime one person acquires all of the interests in the land. That completes our discussion of the future interests that are created in a grantor, namely the possibility of reverter, the right of entry or power termination, and the reversion. There are two other kinds of future interests, but they're created in someone other than a grantor. I'll tell you their names right now. The first one is called a remainder, and there are certain specific rules that remainders have to comply with. And the other is called an executory interest. It's a future interest created in someone other than the grantor that doesn't comply with the rules for remainders. But we're ahead of our story. That's the subject for the next video. You're invited to watch the next video to learn about remainders and executory interests. If you have questions or comments, email ProfDale01@gmail.com. And thanks for watching.